The sun was beginning to set over the quiet neighborhood as Layla and her teenage son, Jamal, strolled through the streets, their shadows stretching along the sidewalk. Layla, a black woman in her 40s, was known for her calm and collected demeanor. As a human rights consultant, she had spent years teaching people how to navigate injustice with dignity and resilience. Her work was respected, and her community looked up to her as a figure of quiet strength. Jamal, her 15-year-old son, walked beside her, listening intently as she shared lessons from the seminar she had just led. The evening was meant to be a peaceful conclusion to a long day, and Layla was grateful for the time to connect with her son. Jamal had always admired his mother's poise, especially in the face of adversity. She had raised him to believe in justice, resilience, and the power of knowledge. Layla often said that real strength wasn't about physical power, but about self-control and wisdom. Jamal took these lessons to heart, though he sometimes questioned how far patience and calm could go when faced with true aggression. As they walked, he asked his mother, "But Mom, what if someone just doesn't want to listen? What if they want to hurt you, no matter what you say?" Layla smiled gently, recognizing the tension between his youthful drive for justice and the calm restraint she'd cultivated over the years. "Son, there are people in this world who act from fear and anger. They see what they don't understand as a threat. But if you let their anger make you angry, they've already won. Sometimes the hardest fight is staying calm when everything inside you says to fight back. The more control you have over yourself, the less power they have over you." Jamal nodded, trying to absorb her wisdom, though he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd have a hard time staying calm if someone treated his mom unfairly. They walked past a small grocery store, the lights flickering as the owner prepared to close for the night. It was a typical evening, the kind that felt safe, almost routine. Little did they know that safety was about to be shattered. A few blocks away, Officer Greg Thompson was finishing his patrol. Thompson was in his late 30s, a seasoned officer with a reputation for being strict, almost aggressive, especially with people he thought didn't belong. He had grown up in a small, predominantly white town, and he'd carried certain biases with him into his career. Though he'd never say it aloud, he felt uncomfortable when he saw people of color in what he considered nice neighborhoods where he thought they were out of place. Tonight, Thompson was in a foul mood. He had just come off a heated argument with his supervisor over an incident the previous week. He'd been reprimanded for being too rough during an arrest, and it left him bitter and defensive. He resented the fact that people were too sensitive these days, constantly scrutinizing his every move. To him, he was just doing his job, keeping order in the way he saw fit. As he cruised down the street, Thompson's eyes locked onto Layla and Jamal. Something about them triggered his well-worn instincts. They didn't look like they were from around here, at least not to him. It didn't matter that they were simply walking home in his mind. They were suspicious just by being there. Ignoring his training and bypassing any call for backup, Thompson decided to approach them on his own. He pulled his squad car to the curb, stepped out, and adjusted his belt as he walked toward them, radiating a false air of authority that quickly turned into intimidation. Layla noticed the police car and instinctively took Jamal's hand. "Stay calm," she whispered. "We haven't done anything wrong." Jamal felt his mother's hand tighten around his, a subtle but powerful gesture of reassurance. He tried to remember her words about self-control, but he could feel a spark of anxiety creeping in. He had seen videos, heard stories from friends, about encounters with police that didn't end well. He could feel his heart starting to race. "Evening, folks," Thompson said, his voice tinged with a forced politeness that only thinly veiled his suspicion. He looked Layla up and down, then shifted his gaze to Jamal, assessing them with an intensity that was anything but friendly. "You live around here?" Layla maintained her calm, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Yes, officer. We're just on our way home." She kept her tone neutral, polite, yet firm, as she taught herself to do in such situations. But Thompson wasn't looking for polite answers. He wanted submission, compliance, the silent acceptance that he was in charge. Instead, he saw a woman who was clearly not intimidated, and it irked him. "You look a little out of place," he said, his words laced with thinly veiled aggression. "Got any ID on you?" Jamal felt his stomach twist. He could sense the hostility in the officer's tone, the way he spoke to his mother, as if she were a suspect. He clenched his fists, his mother's advice echoing in his mind, "Stay calm. Don't let them see your anger." But it was harder than he'd imagined. Layla calmly reached into her bag and retrieved her ID, handing it over without a word. She'd done nothing wrong, and she had nothing to hide. Thompson snatched the ID from her hand, barely glancing at it before shoving it back. "And you, kid? Where's your ID?" Jamal's heart pounded. He hadn't expected to be questioned. I don't have any on me, sir," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Thompson's eyes narrowed. "Is that so? Out here wandering around without ID? Seems suspicious, don't you think?" Layla stepped forward slightly, positioning herself between Jamal and Thompson. "Officer, my son isn't required to carry ID. We're just heading home." Thompson's face darkened. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he saw as inferior. "Step back, ma'am," he ordered, his hand hovering over his holster. "I'll ask the questions here." Jamal felt his pulse quicken, a rush of fear mixed with anger. He wanted to speak up, to tell this man to back off, but his mother's presence held him steady. Layla's calm demeanor seemed to act as a shield, protecting him even as she herself faced down Thompson's aggression. "Is there a reason for this?" Officer Layla asked, her voice level, though Jamal could sense the tension in her words. "We haven't done anything wrong, and we're just trying to get home." Thompson sneered. "People like you always got something to hide. Just answer the questions and maybe I won't have to take this any further." Jamal felt a flash of indignation at the officer's words. "People like you," the phrase lingered in his mind, a stark reminder of the discrimination he'd been raised to understand and resist. He could feel his mother's hand tighten on his arm, a silent signal to keep his cool. As the tension between them thickened, Thompson's posture grew more aggressive. Layla saw the way he looked at her son, the barely concealed hostility in his eyes. She knew this could spiral out of control if they didn't handle it carefully. She'd encountered men like Thompson before, men who saw authority as a means of control rather than protection, and she understood the danger of provoking him further. Yet, despite the fear building within her, Layla refused to back down. She kept her gaze steady, meeting Thompson's glare with unwavering resolve. Beside her, Jamal took a deep breath, drawing strength from his mother's courage. He'd been taught that respect was earned, not demanded, and he wasn't about to let this officer belittle him or his mother. In that moment, Jamal realized that everything his mother had taught him about dignity, about resilience, about standing firm in the face of injustice was being put to the test. This wasn't a lesson in a safe classroom or a family discussion at the dinner table. This was real, raw, and happening right in front of him. And he knew that he would have to summon every ounce of strength and self-control to protect the values his mother had instilled in him. As Thompson continued his verbal assault, Layla and Jamal stood their ground, side by side, refusing to be intimidated. This was only the beginning, but in that moment they both knew that they would face whatever came next together, united by a bond that no amount of aggression or hatred could break. Thompson's irritation was growing, his face hardening as he glanced between Layla and Jamal, his jaw clenched tight. He wasn't used to this kind of resistance, especially not from a woman who didn't fit his idea of someone who should be confident in his presence. The quiet defiance in Layla's eyes unsettled him, and he resented the feeling. People like her weren't supposed to look him in the eye, let alone question his authority. With a forced calmness that only barely masked his aggression, he took a step closer to Layla. "Listen, lady," he sneered, "I asked you both a question, and I expect answers without the attitude." Layla kept her voice steady, though she could feel Jamal tensing beside her. "Officer, with all due respect, we've answered your questions. We've told you we're on our way home. There's no need to escalate this." Thompson's eyes narrowed, and he took another step forward, his body language growing more imposing, almost threatening. "Escalate. I'm just doing my job. Keeping this neighborhood safe," he said, his tone dripping with insinuation. "And if you don't want trouble, maybe you should show a little respect." Layla's patience was wearing thin, but she held her ground. She could feel Jamal beside her, his breathing quickening, and she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder to calm him. "Officer, we haven't done anything wrong. Please let us be on our way." Jamal felt his blood boil as he listened to Thompson's veiled threats. His mother's calmness was a small comfort, but it wasn't enough to quell the anger rising inside him. He looked up at Thompson, his eyes defiant. "Why are you treating us like this? We're just walking home. You don't have any reason to stop us." Thompson's expression shifted, a flash of irritation mixed with something darker. He wasn't accustomed to teenagers speaking to him this way, especially not a black kid who should, in his mind, know his place. He leaned down, getting closer to Jamal, his voice lowering to a menacing whisper. "Watch your mouth, kid. I don't take lip from anyone, especially not from smart-mouthed kids like you." Layla's protective instincts flared, and she stepped forward, placing herself between Thompson and Jamal. "That's enough, officer. My son has done nothing wrong, and neither have I. You have no right to speak to us this way." Thompson's eyes flickered with anger. He straightened up, his hand drifting to the baton on his belt. "Oh, I don't have the right. I think you're forgetting who's in charge here." Jamal felt his fists clenching involuntarily, his mind racing through everything his mother had ever told him about staying calm. But the disrespect, the tone, the thinly veiled threats, it was almost too much to bear. He wanted to shout, to tell this man to back off, but his mother's steady presence held him in check. Thompson sneered, looking at Layla with open disdain. "People like you always think you can do whatever you want. Walk around where you don't belong, talk back when you're told to answer a simple question. But guess what? I'm here to make sure everyone follows the rules." Layla's voice remained controlled, though her hands were trembling slightly. "We're not breaking any rules, officer. We're just trying to go home." Thompson chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You think I'm just going to take your word for it? No, I think I need to have a closer look," he gestured to Jamal. "Let's start with him. Empty your pockets, kid." Jamal froze. This was the moment he had feared, the moment his mother had warned him about so many times. He knew he had nothing in his pockets that could be considered suspicious, just his phone and a small notebook. But it wasn't about what he had, it was about what this officer thought he might have. It was about control, about power, about making him feel like he had no choice but to submit. Layla's voice cut through the silence. "My son doesn't need to empty his pockets. You have no reason to suspect him of anything. This is harassment." Thompson's eyes flashed with anger. "Harassment? Lady, I'm giving you a chance to cooperate. But if you want to make this difficult, I can make it a lot harder for both of you." He looked at Jamal with a cold, challenging stare. "You don't want to know what happens if you don't listen." Jamal's heart pounded. but he stood firm, feeling his mother's silent strength beside him. "I don't have anything to hide," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "But I also don't have to do what you're asking, because I haven't done anything wrong." Thompson took a step closer, his face only inches from Jamal's. "You think you're clever, huh? Think you can just talk your way out of this?" he sneered, his voice dropping to a near growl. "You better wise up, kid, before you get yourself into real trouble." Layla could feel the situation spiraling, the tension escalating with every passing second. She knew that Thompson was trying to provoke them, to get a reaction he could use as an excuse to go further. But she also knew that they couldn't just back down. Giving in would mean surrendering their dignity, their right to simply exist without being treated as suspects. She placed a calming hand on Jamal's shoulder, her touch grounding him. Then she looked Thompson directly in the eye, her gaze unwavering. "Officer, we will not be intimidated. You're out of line, and you know it. Now, unless you have a legitimate reason to detain us, we'll be on our way." Thompson's face twisted in fury. He hadn't expected this. He was used to people cowering, to backing down the moment he asserted his authority. But this woman, with her calm defiance and her unshakable dignity, was making him feel powerless in a way that infuriated him. He was losing control of the situation, and it was a feeling he couldn't tolerate. Without warning, he reached out and grabbed Layla's arm, his fingers digging into her skin with unnecessary force. "You're not going anywhere," he snarled. "You think you can just walk away after disrespecting me?" Jamal's anger surged, breaking through the restraint he'd fought so hard to maintain. He couldn't stand by and watch his mother be manhandled, not after everything she had taught him about standing up for what was right. He stepped forward, his voice filled with a courage he hadn't known he possessed. "Let her go." Thompson glared at him, his grip tightening on Layla's arm. "Or what, kid? You gonna try something? Go ahead, make my day." Layla winced as Thompson's fingers dug deeper, but she forced herself to remain calm, for Jamal's sake. She met her son's gaze, silently urging him to stay in control. "Jamal," she said softly, "remember what I taught you." Jamal's chest heaved with the effort to contain his fury. His mother's voice grounded him, reminded him of the strength that came from control, from refusing to let anger dictate his actions. He took a step back, his hands unclenching, though his eyes remained defiant. Thompson smirked, mistaking Jamal's restraint for fear. "That's what I thought. You people are all the same. Talk big, but when it comes down to it, you don't have the guts." Layla's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried an unbreakable resolve. "We're not afraid of you, officer. We're not going to give you the reaction you want. You can try to intimidate us, but we know our rights." Thompson sneered, releasing her arm with a rough shove. He glared at them, his chest heaving, clearly frustrated that he hadn't broken their spirit. He opened his mouth to say something else, but the words caught in his throat. For the first time, he felt a flicker of doubt, as if he was beginning to realize that this wasn't going to end the way he'd intended. Layla and Jamal stood together, side by side, their resolve unshaken. In that moment, Thompson understood that he'd met something stronger than his authority, a family bound by resilience and dignity, refusing to be cowed by fear. And for the first time, he wondered if he'd made a mistake. Thompson took a step back, assessing the situation with growing frustration. He had intended to intimidate Layla and Jamal into compliance, but their resilience, their unwillingness to back down, was getting under his skin. His mind raced, searching for a way to regain control, to reassert his authority over them. He could feel the eyes of a few passers-by who had paused nearby, glancing curiously at the unfolding scene. The fact that people were watching only intensified his need to establish dominance. Layla, sensing Thompson's frustration, took a slow breath, her eyes meeting his with an unflinching calm. She wasn't going to let him intimidate her, not when her son was watching, not after all she'd been through to teach Jamal the value of resilience and dignity. She knew this was about more than just this moment. It was about showing Jamal that they didn't have to submit to abuse, that they could stand tall, even in the face of unwarranted hostility. Jamal stood beside her, his body tense, ready to react if Thompson made another move. He could feel his heart pounding, each beat a reminder of the anger simmering beneath his surface. Every instinct told him to fight back, to protect his mother from this man's aggression, but his mother's presence, her unwavering calm, held him steady. He knew that this was her way of teaching him a lesson in strength, one that went beyond physical retaliation. But Thompson wasn't done. He couldn't let them walk away, not after they had questioned his authority in front of onlookers. His pride wouldn't allow it. He took a step closer, his hand once again hovering near his baton, as if considering whether he could escalate things further without facing consequences himself. The fact that Layla and Jamal had refused to cower, that they had looked him in the eye with defiance, was something he couldn't tolerate. "All right," he sneered, his voice dripping with forced politeness that barely masked his contempt. "Since you both think you're above following orders, I think it's time for a more thorough investigation." His hand tightened around the baton on his belt, a silent threat. "Let's see what you're really hiding." Layla's expression remained calm, but there was a flicker of worry in her eyes. She knew that Thompson was looking for any excuse to justify his actions, to push them into a corner where he could claim they were resisting. But she refused to let him have that satisfaction. "We have nothing to hide, officer," she said quietly. "But I would appreciate it if you respected our rights." Thompson's sneer widened. "Rights? You think you're in a position to talk about rights?" His voice dropped to a low, menacing tone. "Out here, I decide what's right and what isn't. And I don't take kindly to people who think they're too good to answer a few simple questions." Jamal couldn't hold back any longer. "We've answered your questions," he said, his voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "You're the one who keeps pushing this." Thompson's eyes snapped to Jamal, his face darkening. "Excuse me? I don't remember asking for your opinion, kid." Jamal didn't flinch. "I'm just saying we haven't done anything wrong, so why are you treating us like criminals?" Thompson's hand shifted on his baton, his grip tightening as he took a step closer to Jamal, towering over him. "You've got a big mouth for someone who's in no position to talk back. Maybe I need to teach you a little respect." Layla stepped between them, her voice sharp but controlled. "Leave my son alone, officer. He's done nothing wrong. Neither of us has. This is harassment." Thompson's face contorted with anger. "Harassment? You want to see harassment? I can show you exactly what harassment looks like." He reached out and grabbed Jamal by the arm, his grip rough and unyielding. Jamal felt a surge of fear, but he forced himself to stand firm, refusing to give Thompson the satisfaction of seeing him flinch. Layla's heart pounded as she watched Thompson handle her son with unnecessary force. "Let go of him," she said, her voice carrying an edge she rarely used. "Right now." Thompson ignored her, his gaze fixed on Jamal. "Maybe if you learn to keep your mouth shut, you'll stay out of trouble in the future," he sneered. He tightened his grip, and Jamal bit down the urge to yank his arm free, knowing that any sudden movement could escalate the situation even further. Layla stepped closer, her voice now a barely contained storm. "I said, let him go." Thompson turned his head to look at her, his sneer widening. "Or what? You think you can tell me how to do my job?" He released Jamal's arm but shoved him back roughly, forcing him to stumble before he regained his balance. Jamal's fists clenched, his knuckles turning white as he fought to keep his anger in check. He wanted to shout, to strike back, but his mother's presence grounded him, reminding him of her lessons, of the importance of control. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stand tall, to meet Thompson's gaze without fear. Thompson's face twisted with frustration. He could sense that he wasn't breaking them, that his intimidation tactics weren't working. The fact that they were still standing there, calm and defiant, only added fuel to his anger. He glanced around at the small crowd that had gathered, a few people watching with concern, some whispering among themselves. The presence of witnesses made him more cautious, but it also heightened his need to establish control. He couldn't afford to look weak in front of these people, especially not after his authority had been challenged. "All right," he said slowly, his voice dripping with condescension. "If you're not going to cooperate, I'm going to have to search you both, just to make sure you're not carrying anything suspicious." Layla's jaw tightened. She knew that Thompson had no legal grounds for a search, and he was only using it as an excuse to assert his power. "There's no reason for a search, officer. We haven't done anything wrong, and you know it." Thompson's sneer returned. "Funny, I don't remember asking for your opinion on what I can and can't do." He looked over at Jamal, his eyes narrowing. "Starting with you, kid. Empty your pockets. Now." Jamal glanced at his mother, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. He knew she would tell him to stay calm, to comply, but every fiber of his being resisted the idea of submitting to this man's abuse of power. He could feel the heat of humiliation rising in his chest, the indignity of being treated like a criminal for simply existing. But Layla gave him a slight nod, her expression urging him to remain calm, to stay focused. She knew how important it was to avoid giving Thompson any excuse to escalate the situation further. Reluctantly, Jamal reached into his pockets, pulling out his phone and a small notebook he always carried with him. Thompson took the items, examining them with a derisive sneer. "What's this?" he asked, flipping through the notebook with a look of disdain. "You some kind of writer, kid?" Jamal didn't respond, his jaw clenched as he watched Thompson invade his privacy with a twisted sense of satisfaction. He could feel the weight of his mother's steady presence beside him, reminding him to hold on, to resist the urge to lash out. After a few moments, Thompson tossed the notebook back at Jamal, the pages scattering slightly as it landed at his feet. "Nothing interesting," he muttered with disappointment, as if he'd been hoping to find something incriminating. He turned to Layla. "Your turn." Layla felt a surge of anger as she looked at Thompson, but she forced herself to comply, knowing that resisting would only give him an excuse to prolong their ordeal. She carefully handed over her belongings, her expression impassive as Thompson rifled through her things with the same disdain he had shown Jamal. As he searched, Thompson's face twisted with frustration, the realization dawning on him that he wasn't going to find anything to justify his harassment. His grip tightened on Layla's belongings, and for a brief moment she wondered if he would lash out, if his need for control would drive him to cross an even more dangerous line. But then, Thompson released a sharp breath, tossing her things back at her with barely concealed anger. "Fine," he spat. "You're clean." For now he looked at them with a sneer, his voice dripping with a mixture of frustration and resentment. "But don't think for a second that I won't be watching. People like you always find a way to cause trouble." Layla took a deep breath, steadying herself as she collected her belongings. She met Thompson's gaze with an unwavering calm, refusing to let his words affect her. "Thank you for your time, officer," she said, her voice a quiet but firm dismissal. Jamal watched as his mother turned, her composure unshaken, and gestured for him to follow. He could feel the tension still radiating from her, but her control, her grace in the face of such blatant hostility, filled him with a renewed sense of pride. She had stood her ground, shown him what real strength looked like, and he was determined to carry that lesson forward. As they walked away, Thompson's gaze followed them, his face twisted with barely contained rage. He had been defeated, his attempts at intimidation and control shattered by their quiet resilience. Layla and Jamal walked away from Thompson, their pace calm but purposeful, each step an assertion of their dignity. Jamal felt a strange mixture of emotions bubbling inside him: pride in his mother, anger at the officer, and a lingering unease about what had just happened. His mother's unwavering calm had given him strength, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they had narrowly escaped something far worse. As they turned the corner, leaving Thompson and the small crowd behind, Jamal finally exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Mom." That was he struggled to find the words. "How did you stay so calm? He was horrible." Layla looked down at her son, her expression softening as she placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Jamal, there will always be people who try to make you feel small, people who believe they're better than you just because of the color of your skin or where you come from. But you can't let them have that power over you. Staying calm is our way of refusing to give them control." Jamal nodded, trying to absorb her words, but he could still feel the simmering anger in his chest. "I know, Mum, but sometimes it feels like it's not enough, like just standing there and letting them treat us that way is letting them win." Layla's eyes softened as she pulled him into a gentle embrace. "It's not easy, I know, and I wish you didn't have to learn these lessons so young. But remember, Jamal, every time we refuse to stoop to their level, every time we walk away with our dignity intact, we're showing them that they don't have the power to define who we are. That's a victory too, even if it doesn't feel like it." Jamal sighed, his mother's words settling into his heart, even as he struggled with the weight of what they'd just experienced. But before he could respond, a sudden, loud voice shattered their moment of quiet. "Hey, you two! Stop right there." They both turned to see Officer Thompson storming around the corner, his face red with fury. It seemed he hadn't let them go after all. A surge of dread shot through Jamal, but he steeled himself, planting his feet firmly next to his mother. He wasn't about to let this man intimidate him or his mom any further. Layla instinctively moved in front of Jamal, shielding him with her body. "Officer, we've already complied with your requests. We're just trying to go home. Please let us be." Thompson sneered, his eyes flashing with anger. "Let you be? Oh, you'd love that, wouldn't you? People like you think you can just walk away from authority. You think you can disrespect me in front of all those people and just leave." Layla's jaw tightened, but she remained calm. "No one disrespected you, officer. We answered your questions and did as you asked. Now we have every right to leave." Thompson's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I don't think you understand, lady. I decide when you can go, and right now I don't feel like letting you just walk away." Jamal's anger surged again, and he could feel his fists clenching at his sides. He wanted to shout, to tell this man to leave them alone, but he remembered his mother's lessons, her warnings about staying calm, about not giving people like Thompson the reaction they were looking for. But this time it felt different. This time he could see that Thompson wasn't just trying to intimidate them, he was furious, humiliated by their defiance, and looking for any excuse to regain control. Layla, sensing the danger, spoke in a calm, steady voice. "Officer, please, we've done nothing wrong. There's no need for this." Thompson's face twisted into an ugly scowl. "Oh, I think there's every need. You think you're better than me? Walking around here like you own the place, talking back, acting like you're untouchable." He took a step even closer, his voice low and filled with venom. "I'm going to teach you both a lesson." Jamal's heart raced. He could see the shift in Thompson's demeanor, the way his hand hovered over his baton, the darkness in his eyes that betrayed his intentions. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore, this was personal, and Thompson was looking for an excuse to lash out. Without warning, Thompson reached out and grabbed Jamal by the collar, yanking him forward with unnecessary force. Jamal gasped, stumbling as he tried to regain his balance. "What are you doing?" he managed to choke out, his voice strained. Layla's eyes flashed with a protective fury. She stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with warning. "Let go of my son. Right now." Thompson sneered, tightening his grip on Jamal's collar. "I think your boy needs to learn some respect," he spat, his voice filled with contempt. "Maybe a night in a cell will teach him to keep his mouth shut." Jamal struggled against Thompson's grip, feeling a surge of anger and helplessness. He wanted to push the officer away, to fight back, but he could see the rage in Thompson's eyes, the way he was waiting for any excuse to escalate things further. Layla's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Officer Thompson, release him. Now." Thompson glanced at her, his expression twisted with rage. For a moment it seemed he might ignore her, but then slowly he released Jamal's collar, shoving him back roughly. Jamal stumbled, catching himself just in time to avoid falling. Layla stepped between them, her gaze hard and unyielding. "We're leaving. There is no reason for you to continue this." Thompson's lips curled into a sneer. "You think you can just tell me what to do?" He reached for his baton, gripping it tightly. "You're making a big mistake, lady." Jamal's heart pounded as he watched the officer raise the baton slightly, the threat clear. He could see his mother tense, her body positioned protectively in front of him. He knew she wouldn't back down, not after everything they'd been through, but he also knew that this was a dangerous game. Before Thompson could make his next move, Jamal spoke up, his voice steady but filled with a quiet defiance. "Why are you doing this? Just because we didn't bow down to you? You think that makes you strong?" Thompson's eyes snapped to Jamal, his face darkening. "Watch your mouth, kid. You don't know who you're messing with." Jamal felt a surge of courage, fueled by the fear and anger he had been suppressing. He met Thompson's gaze, unflinching. "I know exactly who I'm messing with. Someone who thinks a badge gives him the right to treat people like garbage. But that badge doesn't make you better than us." Thompson's face twisted with rage, his knuckles whitening around the baton. He took a step forward, raising it higher as if preparing to strike. Layla tensed, ready to intervene, but Jamal held his ground, his voice calm and unwavering. "We're not afraid of you," Jamal said, his voice clear and strong. "You can try to intimidate us, but we're not going to cower. You don't get to decide who we are." Thompson hesitated, caught off guard by Jamal's defiance. For a moment he seemed uncertain, as if Jamal's words had struck a nerve, but the uncertainty quickly dissolved into anger. He raised the baton higher, his expression darkening as he prepared to lash out. But just as he was about to strike, a voice rang out from behind them. "Officer Thompson." "What are you doing?" All three of them turned to see another officer approaching, a tall, older man with a no-nonsense expression. His eyes flickered with disapproval as he took in the scene, his gaze lingering on Thompson's raised baton and the fear in Jamal's eyes. Thompson froze, the baton still raised, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Officer Daniels," he said, his voice strained. "I was just handling a situation." Daniels raised an eyebrow, his gaze hardening. "This doesn't look like handling a situation. It looks like you're about to assault a civilian." Thompson's face turned red, and he slowly lowered the baton, his grip loosening as he tried to regain his composure. "They were being uncooperative," he muttered, avoiding Daniel's gaze. Daniels glanced at Layla and Jamal, noting their tense expressions, the way Lila stood protectively in front of her son. He turned back to Thompson, his expression filled with barely concealed disdain. Uncooperative, huh? Or maybe they just didn't submit to your bullying. Thompson's face flushed even deeper, but he didn't respond. He knew that arguing with Daniels would only make things worse. He muttered something under his breath, his gaze dropping to the ground. Daniels looked at Layla and Jamal, offering them a nod of respect. "I'm sorry for the way you've been treated," he said, his tone sincere. "This isn't how we're supposed to protect and serve." Layla's shoulders relaxed slightly, and she gave Daniels a nod in return. "Thank you, officer." Daniels turned back to Thompson, his voice hard. "I think it's time you go back to the station, Thompson. I'll handle things from here." Thompson hesitated, his pride clearly wounded, but he didn't argue. With one last glare at Lila and Jamal, he turned and walked away, his shoulders hunched with frustration. As Thompson disappeared around the corner, Daniels turned back to Layla and Jamal. "Are you both all right?" Layla nodded, though her voice was quiet. "We're fine. Thank you for intervening." Daniels studied them for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I'm sorry you had to go through that. Some people, they don't understand what it means to wear this uniform," he sighed, a hint of regret in his eyes. "If you'd like to file a report, I can help you with that." Layla glanced at Jamal, then back at Daniels. "Thank you. We'll consider it." Daniels nodded, his respect evident. "Take care of yourselves, and know that not all of us are like him." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Layla and Jamal standing together in the fading light. As the tension finally lifted, Jamal looked up at his mother, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and lingering anger. Layla placed a hand on his shoulder, giving him a small, reassuring smile. "You did well, Jamal. You showed strength today, real strength." Jamal nodded, feeling the weight of the experience settling in. He knew that this wasn't the end, that they would face challenges like this again. But he also knew that, with his mother by his side, he would always have the strength to stand tall, no matter what. As Officer Daniels disappeared down the street, Layla felt a wave of relief wash over her. The encounter had ended, at least for now, and they had come out of it with their dignity intact. But despite the resolution, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that lingered in her chest. She glanced down at Jamal, who was standing beside her, his face a mixture of pride and residual anger. He had shown courage beyond his years, but she could see that the experience had left its mark on him. "Let's go home, honey," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that she hoped would ease some of the tension in his mind. They began walking, their footsteps steady and quiet as the evening deepened around them. The neighborhood was beginning to settle down, with only a few people left on the streets, and the soft glow of streetlights casting long shadows. But just as they were rounding the next corner, Layla's heart skipped a beat. A familiar sound cut through the quiet, the rumbling engine of a police car creeping up slowly behind them. She glanced over her shoulder, her stomach tightening as she saw Thompson's squad car, idling just a few yards away, his face barely visible through the windshield, watching them. Layla's pulse quickened. She knew this wasn't a coincidence. Thompson wasn't just passing by, he had followed them, and from the look of him, he wasn't finished. The officer's face was shadowed in the dim light, but she could sense the simmering rage from the way he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension. "Mom," Jamal whispered, catching sight of the car. His voice held a mixture of fear and defiance. "Why is he still here?" Layla forced herself to remain calm, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Stay close to me, Jamal. Just keep walking." They continued down the sidewalk, trying to ignore the looming presence of the car behind them. But within moments, the car sped up, pulling in front of them and blocking their path. Thompson stepped out, his expression hard and unyielding, and for a moment, Layla's mind raced with possibilities. She knew he wouldn't let them go so easily, not after being called out in front of his fellow officer. This wasn't about the law, it was about his pride and his need to assert dominance. Thompson approached them, his posture rigid, eyes narrowed with fury. He wasn't even trying to hide his disdain anymore. "Thought you could just walk away, did you?" he sneered, his voice low and venomous. Layla took a steadying breath, her eyes locking onto his. "Officer Thompson, we complied with everything you asked. Officer Daniels made it clear that we were free to leave. Please step aside and let us pass." Thompson's lips twisted into a smirk. "Oh, you think you're so smart, don't you? Running to Daniels like that, making a scene. But let me tell you something, I don't need Daniels' permission to do my job. You and your little smart-mouthed kid aren't going anywhere until I say so." Jamal clenched his fists at his sides, the tension radiating through his body. He wanted to shout, to tell Thompson to leave them alone, but he remembered his mother's warnings, her constant reminders about keeping control. Instead, he took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus on her steady presence beside him. Layla kept her voice calm, though she could feel her own anger rising. "We've done nothing wrong, officer. You're overstepping your authority. This is harassment." Thompson's eyes flashed with a dangerous light, and he took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low growl. "Harassment? You think this is harassment? Lady, you haven't seen anything yet." Without warning, Thompson reached out and grabbed Layla's arm, his grip tight and bruising. Jamal's heart raced as he watched his mother stumble slightly, her face tightening in pain. He took a step forward, unable to hold back any longer. "Let her go." "Go." Thompson turned to Jamal, his expression twisted with malice. "You got something to say, kid? Go ahead, make my day." Layla looked at her son, a silent plea in her eyes, urging him to stay calm. But Jamal couldn't stand it anymore. His voice shook with barely contained anger. "You're abusing your power. We're not afraid of you." Thompson's grip on Layla's arm tightened, and he smirked, his eyes filled with contempt. "Oh, you're not afraid? Maybe you should be." Jamal felt a surge of fury, and without thinking, he stepped forward, standing inches away from Thompson. He met the officer's gaze, his voice unwavering. "You can try to scare us all you want, but it won't work. You're the one who's afraid. You're afraid of people who don't bow down to you." Thompson's face twisted, his control slipping as he stared at the defiant teenager in front of him. In one swift motion, he released Layla and turned his full attention to Jamal, looming over him with a look of pure rage. "All right, tough guy," he sneered. "Let's see how brave you are." Before Jamal could react, Thompson grabbed him by the front of his shirt, yanking him forward. Layla gasped, reaching out instinctively, but Thompson blocked her, using his body to shield her from her son. Enough. Layla's voice cracked with a rare edge of desperation as she tried to reach Jamal. "Let him go, Thompson." But Thompson ignored her, his focus solely on Jamal, his voice a low growl. "You think you're a man? You think you can stand up to me?" His grip tightened, and Jamal struggled, his chest tightening as he tried to break free. Jamal's mind raced. Every lesson his mother had taught him about self-control, about staying calm, felt like a distant memory. He was face to face with a man who wanted to humiliate him, to make him feel small, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could resist. "Let him go." Officer Layla's voice was filled with a steely resolve, her eyes blazing with a mix of fear and fury. She took a step forward, her gaze fixed on Thompson. I'm warning you, if you don't let my son go, you'll regret it. Thompson laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. You're warning me? He looked back at Jamal, his face inches from the boy's. Looks like your mama didn't teach you to respect authority. Maybe I'll teach you a lesson she couldn't. Jamal's breathing quickened as he stared back, refusing to break eye contact. He felt the strength of his mother's teachings surge within him, a reminder that he didn't have to give in to fear. He steadied himself, his voice calm but filled with defiance. My mum taught me not to let bullies like you push me around. Thompson's face darkened, and he raised his fist, his knuckles clenched. Layla moved forward, but before she could intervene, a voice rang out from behind them. That's enough, Thompson. Step away from them. Thompson froze, his fist still raised. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the voice. It was Officer Daniels, standing a few yards away, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. He had clearly witnessed enough to understand what was happening, and he was not pleased. Daniels walked forward, his gaze locked onto Thompson. I told you to go back to the station. What do you think you're doing? Thompson's jaw tightened, but he slowly released his grip on Jamal, shoving him back roughly. Jamal stumbled, catching himself just in time to avoid falling. He looked up, meeting his mother's relieved gaze before turning back to Daniels. Daniels stepped between Thompson and the family, his voice cold. This is over, Thompson. You're done here. Go back to the station before you make things worse for yourself. Thompson glared at him, his pride wounded and his rage barely contained. They were resisting, he spat. I was just doing my job. Daniels shook his head, his voice filled with quiet fury. Your job doesn't include terrorizing innocent people. I told you to leave them alone, but you couldn't let it go, could you? He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You're the one who's out of control here, Thompson. And if you don't walk away now, I'll make sure you regret it. For a moment, Thompson looked as though he might argue, but the look in Daniel's eyes warned him that he had pushed too far. With one last venomous glare at Layla and Jamal, he turned and stalked back to his squad car, slamming the door behind him. The engine roared to life, and with a screech of tires he sped off into the night, his anger trailing behind him like a dark cloud. As the car disappeared down the street, Daniels turned to Layla and Jamal, his expression softening. Are you both all right? Layla nodded, her voice a little shaky but filled with gratitude. Yes, Officer Daniels. Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up. Daniels shook his head, a look of regret flickering in his eyes. I'm sorry you had to go through that. Thompson. He's not fit to wear the badge. I'll be filing a report about this. He won't get away with it. Jamal looked up at Daniels, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and frustration. Why is he even allowed to be a cop if he acts like that? It's not right. Daniels sighed, his face shadowed with a sadness that came from years of seeing men like Thompson misuse their authority. Sometimes the system fails us, he admitted, his voice heavy. But that doesn't mean we give up. People like Thompson thrive on fear and power, but they're not invincible. We can hold them accountable, one step at a time. Layla placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder, squeezing gently as she looked at Daniels. Thank you, officer. We'll definitely be filing a report as well. It's time people like him face consequences. Daniels nodded, a spark of respect in his eyes as he looked at her and her son. You two are stronger than most people I know. It takes courage to stand up to someone like him, and you did it with dignity. Jamal felt a surge of pride at Daniel's words, the weight of the ordeal beginning to lift slightly. He looked up at his mother, who gave him a small, encouraging smile. They had faced down a storm together, and despite the fear, they had come out of it stronger. As they turned to leave, Daniels called out softly, "Take care of yourselves. And remember, there are people out there who are on your side." Layla and Jamal nodded, exchanging a grateful glance before they walked away, leaving the darkness of the encounter behind them. The path ahead felt lighter, their bond stronger, and as they stepped into the night, they knew they would face whatever came next with resilience and unwavering unity. Layla and Jamal continued down the street, moving away from the tension that Officer Thompson had left in his wake. The night was quiet, but the intensity of the encounter still lingered, as if the air itself held onto the conflict. They walked in silence for a while, both processing what had just happened. The relief of finally being free from Thompson's harassment was tempered by the lingering anger and the frustration of knowing that, despite everything, officers like him continued to abuse their power. Jamal couldn't shake the mixture of fear and defiance he'd felt in Thompson's grip. He had always understood that being black in America came with risks, that he would be judged and targeted in ways that others weren't. But this was the first time he'd experienced it so directly, so viscerally. He felt older, in a way, as if a part of his innocence had been stripped away by the experience. He glanced up at his mother, noting the quiet strength in her expression, a resolve that refused to be broken. She had faced this all before he could tell. And that realization brought him a strange sense of comfort and sadness all at once. They were almost home when Jamal finally broke the silence. "Mom, how do you stay so strong? I mean, how do you keep going, even when people like him try to tear you down?" Layla looked down at her son, her expression softening as she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Jamal, it's not easy. There are days when it feels overwhelming, like the world is too full of hate and prejudice to ever change. But if we give in to that feeling, if we let people like Thompson make us feel small or helpless, then they win. Strength doesn't mean we don't feel fear or anger. It means we don't let those feelings define us." Jamal absorbed her words, nodding slowly. But before he could respond, the low rumble of a car engine interrupted them. Layla's heart sank as she recognized the sound. Thompson's squad car was creeping up behind them once again, its headlights casting an eerie glow onto the pavement. She exchanged a worried glance with Jamal, her mind racing. How could this be happening? After everything, Thompson was still coming after them. Thompson's face was barely visible in the dark, but Layla could see the outline of his form behind the wheel, his figure rigid with anger. He pulled the car to a stop just a few feet away, then stepped out, slamming the door with enough force to echo down the empty street. There was something unhinged in his movements now, a barely restrained fury that sent a chill down Layla's spine. This wasn't just about authority anymore. This was personal. "Didn't think I was done with you, did you?" Thompson's voice cut through the stillness, dripping with venom. He took a step forward, his eyes fixed on Layla and Jamal, and in that moment, Layla realized he had no intention of letting them go without one last attempt to assert his power. Layla raised her hands slightly, trying to project calm even as her heart pounded in her chest. "Officer Thompson, we've done everything you asked. We just want to go home. Please, leave us alone." Thompson sneered, taking another step closer. "Leave you alone? After the disrespect you showed me? After you made me look like a fool in front of my colleagues?" His voice grew louder, more intense, as his anger spilled over. "People like you think you're untouchable. You think you can just walk around, challenging authority, talking back, acting like you own the place. But I'll show you just how wrong you are." Jamal felt his body tense as Thompson moved closer, his fists clenching at his sides. Every instinct told him to protect his mother, to stand up to this man who had pushed them so far. But he remembered his mother's words, her lesson about control, and he took a steadying breath, forcing himself to stay grounded. Layla's voice was calm but resolute. "You don't scare us, Officer Thompson. We've done nothing wrong, and no amount of intimidation will change that." Thompson's face twisted into a snarl. "You think you're so brave, don't you?" He took another step, his hand drifting toward his baton. "Let's see how brave you are when there's no one else around to protect you." In that moment, Jamal could feel his mother's hand on his shoulder, a grounding presence that filled him with a sense of calm, even in the face of Thompson's growing rage. But the fear in his mother's eyes betrayed her, and Jamal knew they had to act carefully. This man was unpredictable, and they had no way of knowing how far he would go to assert his control. Layla took a step forward, her gaze locked onto Thompson's. "This has gone too far. You're only making things worse for yourself." Thompson laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed down the empty street. "Worse for myself? Lady, you don't get it, do you? You're the one who's in the wrong place at the wrong time. No one cares what happens to people like you." But before he could make another move, a sudden voice rang out from down the street. "Officer Thompson." They all turned to see a small group of people approaching from the far end of the block. It was their neighbors, several men and women who had seen Thompson's car lingering and had come to investigate. One of them, an older man named Mr. Lewis, was a respected figure in the community. He walked with a slow, determined stride, his face etched with concern as he took in the scene. Thompson's face paled slightly, his posture stiffening as he realized they weren't alone anymore. The group moved closer, their presence a silent but powerful reminder that Layla and Jamal weren't isolated, that they were part of a community that wouldn't stand by and let this abuse go unanswered. Mr. Lewis spoke again, his voice firm. "What's going on here, Officer Thompson? Is there a reason you're harassing Layla and her son in the middle of the night?" Thompson's sneer faltered, but he quickly recovered, attempting to project authority. "This is police business, Mr. Lewis. I suggest you and your friends keep moving." But Mr. Lewis didn't budge. He crossed his arms, his gaze unyielding. "Looks like harassment to me, and I think a lot of people here would agree." Around him, the neighbors murmured in agreement, their faces set in expressions of quiet defiance. Thompson looked around, his frustration mounting as he realized he was outnumbered. The power he had wielded so ruthlessly just moments before was slipping away, replaced by a growing sense of vulnerability. His hand dropped from his baton, his posture shrinking as he faced the unflinching wall of community solidarity. Layla felt a surge of relief as she looked around at the faces of her neighbors, each one standing as a silent testament to the strength and unity of their community. She reached down and squeezed Jamal's hand, a small gesture of reassurance that they weren't alone. One of the other neighbors, a woman named Mrs. Harris, stepped forward, her voice filled with quiet anger. "We've all seen how you've treated Layla and Jamal tonight, officer. You have no right to act this way." Thompson's face flushed with anger and humiliation, his gaze darting between the neighbors and Layla. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. The authority he had clung to so desperately had evaporated, leaving him exposed and powerless. Finally, he took a step back, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Fine," he muttered, barely audible. "Have it your way." He turned and walked back to his car, the weight of his failure evident in every step. The group watched in silence as he climbed into the driver's seat and sped off, his anger trailing behind him like a dark cloud. As the sound of the car faded into the distance, Layla turned to her neighbors, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, all of you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come." Mr. Lewis shook his head, his expression warm but firm. "No need to thank us, Layla. We take care of our own. And people like him. They have no place here." Jamal looked around, his face a mixture of relief and awe as he took in the strength of the community around him. For the first time, he truly understood what his mother had been teaching him about resilience and unity. It wasn't just about facing challenges alone, it was about knowing when to lean on others, to find strength in the people who stood beside you. Mrs. Harris placed a gentle hand on Jamal's shoulder, her voice filled with warmth. "You were brave tonight, young man. Your mother taught you well." Jamal smiled, his heart swelling with pride. He looked up at his mother, a new understanding in his eyes. They had faced down a force much bigger than themselves, and they had done it with dignity and grace. And in the end, they hadn't just survived, they had triumphed. As they walked home, surrounded by the protective presence of their neighbors, Leila knew that tonight had been a turning point, not just for her and Jamal, but for the entire community. They had stood up to fear and intimidation, refusing to be silenced or oppressed. And as the night settled around them, Leila felt a renewed sense of hope. She knew that there would be more challenges ahead, more encounters with people like Thompson who sought to undermine their dignity. But tonight had shown her that they were not alone, that together they could face anything and come out stronger on the other side. As Leila and Jamal finally reached the front steps of their home, they felt a weight lift from their shoulders. The night had been long, tense, and deeply unsettling, yet they had come through it with their dignity intact. Leila unlocked the door, and they stepped inside, the familiar warmth of their living room wrapping around them like a comforting embrace. Jamal dropped onto the couch, exhaling a deep breath as he sank into the cushions, his eyes still wide from the adrenaline that had carried him through the night. Leila sat beside him, placing a gentle hand on his back. She could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped, and she knew that tonight would leave a mark on both of them. But there was also a quiet pride in his expression, a newfound strength that she hadn't seen before. Jamal had faced down fear, looked injustice in the eye, and refused to back down. For a moment they sat in silence, the events of the evening settling around them like a heavy fog. Leila's mind drifted back to the confrontation, to the look in Officer Thompson's eyes, the malice and anger that had fueled his every move. She shivered slightly, knowing that there were others like him out there, people who saw their lives as expendable, unworthy of respect or compassion. But then she thought of their neighbors, of Mr. Lewis and Mrs. Harris, and the others who had stepped forward to stand with them. Their presence had been a reminder of the power of community, of the strength that came from unity and solidarity. They weren't alone, not as long as they had people willing to speak up, to defend them in moments of need. That thought filled her with a sense of hope, a belief that, even in the face of hatred, there was still goodness, still a reason to keep fighting. Jamal broke the silence, his voice soft but steady. "Mom, do you think he'll come back? People like him don't just give up, right?" Leila looked at her son, her heart aching at the question. He was so young, and yet he had already seen the darker side of the world, already understood the risks they faced simply for existing as they did. She placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently. "I don't know, Jamal. But I do know this tonight: you were stronger than fear. You didn't let him break you, and that's something no one can take away." Jamal nodded, his face contemplative. It feels like no matter what we do, there's always going to be someone like him, someone who thinks they can treat us like we don't matter." Leila's gaze softened, and she pulled him into a hug, her voice gentle as she spoke. "Maybe there will be, Jamal. But that's why we keep fighting, why we stand together. Because every time we refuse to back down, every time we choose to hold our heads high, we're showing them that we're not afraid. And that's something they can't control." Jamal leaned into her embrace, feeling the comfort of her words settle deep within him. He understood now, in a way he hadn't before, what his mother had been teaching him all along. This wasn't just about one night, one officer, or even one community. It was about a lifetime of resilience, of choosing courage over fear, of believing in the value of his own life, even when others tried to diminish it. As they sat together, a quiet strength settled between them, a bond that had only grown stronger through the night's trials. Layla knew that this experience would shape Jamal, would deepen his understanding of the world and his place in it. And while she wished he didn't have to learn these lessons so young, she also knew that he was prepared, that he had the wisdom, strength, and compassion to face whatever came next. In the days that followed, word of the incident spread throughout the community. Neighbors came by to check on Layla and Jamal, offering words of support and solidarity. Mr. Lewis and Mrs. Harris visited often, their presence a comforting reminder of the allies they had in their corner. Together, they shared stories of their own encounters with prejudice, of the quiet resistance they practiced each day simply by living their lives with dignity and pride. The community began to organize, fueled by a shared desire to make sure that no one else would face what Layla and Jamal had endured. They held meetings, discussing ways to bring about change, to hold officers like Thompson accountable for their actions. There was talk of filing formal complaints, of reaching out to local officials, of demanding greater oversight and accountability. And through it all, Layla and Jamal were at the center, their story a rallying cry for justice and reform. Jamal found himself growing through the experience, his voice gaining strength and confidence as he spoke at meetings, shared his perspective, and inspired others to join the fight. He became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even the youngest among them had the power to stand up to injustice. And with each passing day, he felt his mother's pride and support, her unwavering belief in his strength. One evening, as they sat together on their front porch, Layla turned to him, her eyes filled with warmth. "You know, Jamal, I always knew you had this strength in you. But seeing you grow into it, watching you become a leader, I can't tell you how proud I am." Jamal smiled, a quiet confidence in his expression. "I learned it all from you, Mum. You taught me how to be strong, how to stand up for what's right." Layla's gaze softened, and she took his hand, squeezing gently. "And you've taken those lessons further than I ever could have imagined. You're part of something bigger now, something that will make a difference for all of us." Jamal nodded, feeling the weight of her words, the responsibility that came with them. He knew that this journey was only beginning, that there was still so much work to be done. But he was ready, and he was willing. Together, he and his mother would continue to stand against the forces that tried to hold them down, their spirits unbreakable, their courage unwavering. In the quiet of that evening, as the stars began to twinkle overhead, Layla and Jamal sat together, the strength of their bond a beacon of hope in a world that so often seemed dark and unyielding. They knew there would be more challenges, more trials that would test their resolve. But they also knew that, as long as they had each other and the community that had rallied around them, they would face it all with courage and dignity. And so, with the lessons of the past firmly in their hearts and the support of their neighbors at their side, they looked to the future with a renewed sense of purpose. For Layla, for Jamal, and for everyone who had been touched by their story, this was more than just an ending. It was a beginning, a promise that they would continue to fight for justice, for respect, and for the right to live their lives without fear.